We are ready to kick it off. And before we announce the next panel, we have a special promotional announcement to make. And to do that, we have a guitar coming on stage.
Yeah, so this is Rob Castaneda, CEO of Service Rocket, one of the sponsors for this event. So Rob, how do you get to win this guitar?
Yeah, I think we figured out that everyone else already has an iPad. And if you go home from a conference with another iPad, that's kind of, same old, same old. So our thing is we give away a Fender Stratocaster at every conference. So we have this just at the table in the back corner, and drop us your business card, say hello, and play a bit of Rocksmith, and you can win this.
So they use the guitar to generate leads, which makes it a lead guitar. We're here all night. We're just warming up.
I just flew in from Berlin. My arms are tired.
So we announced before the break that Greg Schott would be coming up here, the CEO of Mulesoft. We're actually going to have a conversation from 3 open source CEOs. So I mentioned Greg, who's the CEO of Mulesoft. We've also got Mark Brewer, who's the CEO of TypeSafe. Is that like a blogging company? What does TypeSafe do?
It is not. It is not. You remember that? Yeah, the old days, TypePad. Yeah, TypeSafe is kind of the leader in this new reactive programming. I don't know if you've heard of it. Interesting new push on how to build and scale your architecture. And at the company, they have the folks that came up with Scala and Akka, this amazing actor-based framework in the programming world.
And during the panel, Sarah mentioned what sort of happened with the MySQL community. We have the man to thank for that. Also joining the group, Marten, Mickos, the CEO of MySQL, who is now the CEO of Eucalyptus. And so Marten, Mark, and Greg are going to join Salil on stage. We're going to have each CEO give some brief remarks, and then Salil will lead a Q&A session with the 3. So Greg, Mark, and Marten, if you could make your way up to the stage, that would be great. And we'll turn the time over to Salil.
Hey, good to see you. So let me quickly introduce these rock stars here. So way on the left is Greg Schott. He used to be, he's done a lot of things, but I first met him when he was VP of marketing at SpringSource, and then he became CEO of Mulesoft. Mark Brewer was VP of lots of things at Covalent, and then SpringSource, and then VMware, and now he is CEO of TypeSafe, the company behind the Scala language and the Akka and Play frameworks for Scala and Java. And this is Marten Mickos, who was CEO of MySQL, which sold eventually to Sun Microsystems for about $1 billion. Exactly $1 billion, was it? And now he's CEO of Eucalyptus, a company that makes cloud software that lets you run on-premise clouds that are compatible with Amazon Web Services. So Nate, if you could put up that slide number 4 for what I'm going to ask these guys. And you know all this already. These are the talking points I sent you. All right.
Have we seen this?
What's that? Yeah.
Have we seen it?
Yeah, you've seen it. You haven't seen it with the pictures and the logos. So what I'd like to learn from 3 of these gentlemen is part 1, their personal story, how they got involved in these open source projects, why they created or joined these companies, what are the best and worst parts of being involved in them, what was it like to raise money, dealing with VCs, what are the things unique about open source, were they the professional CEO? In all 3 of their cases, they were the professional CEO that was brought in to run the company. And then part 2 is the project itself. What is it? What does it do? What do you sell? What was the traction when you started? Who do you sell to? Why do people buy? All that kind of stuff. So if we could all spend 5 minutes, so each of you with a 5-minute monologue just to talk about maybe the first part, or if you prefer to go into the second part first, that's fine too. And just talk for 5 minutes without interruptions. I'll sit quietly over here, and we'll do sort of one round of 5 minutes, another round of 5 minutes, and I might have a couple of questions in between the 2 things, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So Greg, why don't you take us in?
Okay, so 5 minutes to kind of get through.
One or the other,
One or the
or
other.
any combination.
One or the other. Okay. And 30 seconds to talk about 111 Minute. We had our holiday party here a couple of years ago, and they sent me over the week before the holiday party to check out the space, and they have rotating art exhibits here, and it was all covered with kind of pornography. Or it was art, but it was special kind of art. And I called my assistant up and said, "Oh my God!" They said, "Don't worry, it's changing next week." So anyway, and then it changed to vampire art, which was still a little disturbing for the holiday party, but it was okay.
We tried to get that exhibit back in.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just cover some of these points. I'd been in software. Started with Spring Source, kind of my first open source opportunity. Knew that a little bit from the middleware space. Saw one of our head of sales had moved over to Mule. The company was, at the time, it was the beginning of 2009. Things were tough all over. Mule had an interesting opportunity, kind of the beginnings of a good company, had some good growth. Good board, and that's what kind of drew me in. I saw there was this integration space, biggest unsolved IT problem ever, and it was an opportunity to potentially go do something interesting around that. And we had some good traction, good open source project around it. Best part is it's just fun to be working on a business model that is so transformative and so different than everything that had come before open source. I don't think open source is particularly new at this point anymore, but it's still, the models are just so different than what the legacy vendors are using, and it's just fun to have that kind of edge. And the worst part of it's kind of the other side of that, which is trying to figure out how to kind of manage a commercial model where you're giving away software for free, and sometimes you're competing against yourself in the marketplace. And frankly, I found, for us at least, the hardest part sometimes is you feel like you're running really kind of two companies. You're having to do marketing and product and everything around open source to drive the adoption there, and then you're telling your marketing team, okay, schizophrenically kind of move over and now market to the commercial side of the house and have websites that cater to both, and kind of have one foot in the commercial world and one foot in the adoption world, and that's challenging. You have to be successful at both to be a successful open source company. Raising money and dealing with VCs, that's a whole separate discussion. Let's see. Traction for us was, at the time, we were open source enterprise service bus, service-oriented architecture technology. SOA had kind of fallen out of favor at the time, and downloads were pretty flat, and we were trying to figure out how to get it to climb again. A couple things created we did a good job ourselves from a marketing standpoint, from a product standpoint, but also all the SaaS adoption. And while SOA hasn't become cool again and probably never will, integration is an age-old problem that will never go away. And the services that used to be services that people thought about, web services, on-prem type things, have all moved over, and now it's APIs. So public APIs are nothing more, now arguably the web in general is nothing more than service orientation. So the need for what we do as a core backbone to connect things together has never gone away, and we're feeling kind of the wind at our backs now from a download standpoint, a user standpoint, just because of all the SaaS that's being used. Everybody is kind of talk about BYOD. There's BYO SaaS now, where you've got companies that have tens or hundreds of apps that people have drug in and swiped credit cards for, and at some point they run back to the IT department and say, okay, you started using this stuff and my whole department loves it and it's great, but we didn't think we were going to have to connect it to anything. Now we have to connect it back to SAP or to Salesforce or out to the web onto something like a Twitter or Facebook. We need to make those connections happen, and so they pull us in one way or another. We either get pulled in through the IT world or we get pulled in through line of business, and that's kind of what's creating the wind at our sails at this point. Sales model is started out as something that was very much of a on the phone, high transaction sales model. We still do that, but it has started to morph fairly dramatically to larger 6- and 7-figure enterprise deals, and that means we have a sales force that's more oriented toward solution-based selling and sales engineers And we're trying to keep it from being kind of 8-legged IBM type sales calls, but it is certainly starting to get much more enterprise focused in our selling methodology. All right.
There are a number of questions I can think of based on what you said, but we'll come back to those. One thing I forgot to mention was Greg's company just, and this is public and it was announced, so I can mention it, they just raised a big round at an $800 million valuation. So that was in the last month or so. So congrats to him on that. Mark is CEO of TypeSafe, and it's got the interesting challenge that it originally started off trying to monetize a language called Scala. And then recently, in the last year and a half or so, they've realized that there are other ways to monetize around Scala. So I'd like him to talk about that. But also, don't forget the personal story of Covalent and SpringSource and VMware, and now being brought in to run TypeSafe.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I'm amongst other old timers in the open source world here, but it's hard to imagine it's been almost 15 years. Yeah, it's going on 15 years that I've been involved in open source companies. The first one was Covalent. Covalent was known for bringing Apache-based software to the enterprise under commercial terms or commercial licenses. So in 2000, when I joined Covalent, we basically had an open core model of taking the Apache web server and some modules around it, packaging it up, and selling it as an enterprise commercially licensed distribution. And I'll pick on open source business models as I go through kind of my story here. But one of the challenges with that was the people were already adopting Apache. They were using it as fast as people launched or set up new servers, they were putting Apache on it, as opposed to back then it was Netscape and Internet Explorer, and really Apache was killing all of them. But the challenge with the business model was that we were asking people to switch out their Apache servers and put in our commercial distribution, the one that we sold as a commercially licensed product, even though it was all based on Apache, and in fact was probably the exact same version that they were already using. You can imagine what the ops guys said when we said, you have to uninstall that shit and install this one. It didn't go over very well. And so what I learned in that lesson is, number one, VCs don't always know how to define a good business model, because we were basically following their lead. Nobody else had really defined one yet other than Red Hat, and MySQL was really just getting started too. So what happened was the company went through a couple of funding rounds. We built a product that later became Hyperic, which was a management and monitoring tool, initially targeted at monitoring and managing open source based stuff, right? Linux on up. And when the company couldn't get funded in 2003, the VCs wanted to shut it down. And I had already pitched them a couple of times on spinning out the Apache business, but I wanted to run it as an open source services model, right, as opposed to an open core model. And they weren't too hot on that idea, but when the company couldn't get funded, they agreed to sell it to me. So myself and one of the other founders bought Covalent. We spun out Hyperic, or what became Hyperic. That was a separate group. And then we ran the business in a very simple manner. We said anybody that has Apache web servers running and they want support on them, support where they can ask questions, where they get SLAs on fixes or security vulnerabilities, we would cover it, as long as it was a version that we felt comfortable we could support. And by the way, we still had our commercial distribution, but we made that available to them under the term of the support or subscription at their choosing. So in other words, if they didn't want to use it, they didn't have to. The goal was, of course, to get them to use it so that we got our lock-in on that commercial distribution. Anyway, fast forward, that worked for 4 years. I built a business around Apache web server and Apache Tomcat, to where we were doing about $5 million in revenue. We sold to a company that Greg was at. It was called SpringSource. And that tied the development framework, Spring, to a runtime, Tomcat, and enabled developers to basically have a preferred platform to build their Spring or run their Spring applications on. And that business model, of course, was a combination of services around the framework, so training and consulting, commercial license and support around the runtime, Tomcat, and all the pieces around Tomcat. And of course, that company, it grew very fast, both because of that acquisition, but also because the framework was just so widely popular. And I'm sure Rod would say something different, but I like to think Spring really did one thing well. It enabled Java developers to get their job done, right? Java developers were struggling with whether it was EJBs or whatever. It didn't matter what they were using. They were struggling with it and trying to build apps. Spring made it possible for them to get those apps out. And with Tomcat as the container, it made it easy to deploy, made it easy to run those applications. And of course, it made it so our company could make some money. And just a side note, that business from 4 million, by the time myself and a few others left VMware, it was about 178 million in annual revenue. And that's a subscription-based business. That's where somebody's paying for a license to use it for a term, right? Okay, so VMware acquired us in 2009. What happened? Went to a big company again, and this was the second time in my career, and enjoyed it for a little while, but the lessons learned there were really, I didn't fit in in a large company. I belonged in a small startup, and I was out looking at technologies for VMware as part of my role in running operations that we might bring into Cloud Foundry, bring into the kind of middleware group inside of VMware. And I found this little project called Scala, which is, of course, a language, and I found Akka, which is think of it as a containerless runtime for running your Java or your Scala applications. And most importantly, it allows you to scale in the cloud elastically, up and down, based on need, not based on servers available. So anyway, we didn't acquire them, obviously, but I left VMware, and they were looking for a CEO, so I joined in 2012, and I see I'm running out of time. So before I'll wrap that up, and I want to make a comment on what I've learned over my career in open source. There's really 3 things that have worked for me. Number one, when you're building an open source business, choose a license that is the right license for the target, for the people who are using it, not for your business model. Because if you don't choose it for who you're trying to get to use your software, instead you choose it so how you can monetize, you're probably going to restrict or limit how big you can grow. Number 2, and probably most important, is foster, develop, invest in your community like it's the difference between success and failure, because it is. If you don't grow your community, if your community isn't thriving, that whatever your product is, you're going to suffer. And the last one is monetize how and when your constituent you're selling to, when it's appropriate for them. So make sure you don't force yourself into a monetization strategy just because you need to monetize. There's other ways you can make money around open source software, right? You can make money on services. That's what TypeSafe did, SpringSource did as well. Sold training and consulting. Didn't figure out how to make money on a product until after we had a large audience or a large number of users, and also had a really clear idea who we were targeting. So, stop the clock. Yeah, okay.
All right. Thanks, Mark. So before I ask Martin this question, I just want to let the audience know that we like to not surprise our guests, and that Martin's had fair warning that I'm going to ask this question. And the question is, when you showed up at MySQL to run the company versus when you showed up to run Eucalyptus, what went right at MySQL and what went wrong at Eucalyptus?
Yeah, it's the same guy. And I should be smarter now. Well, first of all, I love problems that are really difficult and nearly impossible. And we had such a challenge at MySQL. We built it into a fantastic business. We pioneered the open source business models. We show that you can combine community and business in one, although it hurts, but it can be done. What MySQL had done absolutely right before I joined and kept doing was there was an amazing focus on the customer. So it's all started in the Python language, where there was the MySQL database included in the language back then, and then they added MySQL, which emulated the exact same API as MySQL and just was a little bit more stable. So people said, okay, if there are 2 databases and one is more stable, I use the one that's more stable. And the next step was in the PHP world, when Rasmus Lerdorf said, it's such a mess with databases. When you try to browse through data on a website, you can't go 20 rows at a time because relational databases don't support it. And overnight, the MySQL founder wrote the code for the limit clause, which violates the SQL standard, but made browsing on a website easy. And now all relational databases have it, but back then it was a violation of the standard. So MySQL had this extreme focus on customers, was ready to violate any principles that were out there, and also always did things in a simple way. And people came to me and said, Marten, MySQL is just a glorified file system. And I smiled back and said, so? Meaning the fact that we didn't do store procedures and triggers, the fact that we didn't do all of that stuff that you have in relational databases, that was actually our strength. And we had to have the strength to not develop them. Once we developed them many years later, it complicated our product and made everything go slower. So we might even have made a mistake there then. So at MySQL, this extreme focus on users and simplicity and being ready to violate accepted practices was the thing that drove it to success. When I came to Eucalyptus, I was presented with a similar story. Here's the most popular cloud platform, runs wonderfully well, go in and build a billion-dollar business here. Well, turned out the product was a prototype at the time. There hadn't been an intense focus on users. There had been an intense focus on the concept of cloud platforms, an intense focus on Amazon compatibility, an intense focus on many very valuable things, but not on the customers. So when we brought the product out to users and customers, they hurt themselves on it. Eucalyptus was a very temperamental product. You had to love it really deeply to really make it work well. And then it worked well. But you had to have this endless empathy and passion for the product in order to make it work. Like some people today would argue that you need for OpenStack to make it work. So anyhow, so there were some similarities between MySQL and Eucalyptus, and still are very strong similarities, but also a completely different original approach where MySQL came in and said, what's the simplest way of pleasing and delighting users? And Eucalyptus came to it and said, what's the most all-encompassing way of solving this private cloud research question that we had? So we've been fixing that. Now we have an amazing product in Eucalyptus. It just works. People love it. It's not complicated. It's not messy. You don't have to install 7 different projects to get it to work. We've really worked hard on it, but that has taken time.
Well, actually, why don't you use your last minute?
My last minute?
To talk
my
about
last minute of what?
OpenStack
of my life?
versus Amazon Web Services.
Sorry, about?
OpenStack versus Amazon Web Services, and what is going to be the de facto cloud API.
So I believe very strongly in dominant designs. And I know that Apache was an implementation of HTTP. MySQL was an open source implementation of the SQL standard. Linux is an open source implementation of the POSIX standard. And Eucalyptus, we see ourselves as an open source implementation of the Amazon APIs, which we claim are a de facto standard. But when I say this, people get angry with me. They say, Marten, no, that can't be true. AWS, that's a closed standard. It's a single company. It cannot be a standard. And I say, come on, guys. They have 90% of the market. Look back at what Microsoft did 30 years ago and how Windows became the dominant design of client-server. And everybody tried to resist. And the legacy companies started their own projects, and they built OS2, which was technically superior but couldn't win. So we believe in this amazing power of the Amazon APIs that goes way beyond Amazon themselves. And it's a very interesting question now in the industry whether that's true. Is that how it will play out? Because when I say this, others come to me and say, oh, Marten, you're so wrong. There's Google, and there's Microsoft, and there's the OpenStack consortium. And I say, well, they won't matter because Amazon has such a huge lead. And it's not just about Amazon. It's about the ecosystem that is built around it. But we're in the middle of it, so we don't have the answer yet. That was my minute.
Okay. Yeah, what I find really interesting about what Marten just said is he's going against the grain of open source. OpenStack is the pure play open source model, and Marten.
What's pure with it?
Well, it's community consortium driven. It's an open standard. It checks all the checkboxes. Yeah.
What checkboxes?
There we go.
Sorry.
You used up your minute. But he's saying, well, I'll take a closed standard and I'll implement it open source. But let's circle back to Greg. Greg, can you?
Yeah. What OpenStack is doing is taking an open standard, implementing closed source, because that's what most OpenStack vendors are doing.
They're taking an open.
But we'll come back
they're
to
taking
this.
an open standard and implementing it as closed source code. So, Greg, can you talk a bit about two things? One is you took over Mulesoft when it was very young. It was what, 4 years ago or so, 4.5 5 years ago, and I don't know if you disclosed revenue numbers at that time, but it was very young, and now it's very mature with very high repeatable revenue, high valuation. Talk about that journey, what changes you needed to make, and also what the customer journey is, and how they first find the product, become aware of the product, decide that they need the commercial version, they need to pay for it, et cetera.
So when I started, it was about 20 people, 15 in San Francisco and half a dozen other places, and now we just went over 330 this week. So yeah, there's been a big growth over that time frame. Yeah, the customer journey is we try, and Martin kind of said it well about trying to make sure that you make it just super easy for people to use your product. And we actually started a lot like I think the way Eucalyptus started too, where there's the RTFM mentality, and we actually kind of were even worse than that. It was like read the code if you got a question. So we spent the first year kind of basically telling people to read the code, and then a year later we were telling people to read the bad docs, and then we got to reading okay docs. Now we've got them reading good docs or better docs, still not very happy with where they are. But then we started moving toward everything being packaged, everything being graphical tools. You're trying to get to the most broad base of developer possible and still leaving it open for what we call the high priests of Java to do their thing. So if somebody is really hardcore and they want to get around and muck around with, get down to XML and do whatever they need from a configuration standpoint, we give them that ability. But if somebody is a very basic developer and they can use our graphical tooling, click on a couple connectors. We've got samples and templates there. They can kind of map, if they're going Salesforce to SAP, they can kind of find a template to get going with it and get up and running and fairly productive pretty quickly. And they may be missing the last 10% of it, and they may need their friend's help next door to get them kind of over the finish line, but they can get most of the way there. So that's kind of how our customer experience has changed over time, or user experience, I'd say.
You want another mic?
No, and what about the changes you've had to make in the company over the course of your tenure?
Yeah, it's, to hear you refer to it as a mature company, it doesn't feel very mature. It still feels like we're kind of at the awkward teenage stage. But it's certainly been from a company that was, very, early days, you had to put kind of a combination of immaturity of the organization, but also just kind of in terms of its being focused toward purely adoption, and then growing it over time. We've had to move it toward, a lot more making sure that we keep to being a product company, but also making sure that we've got great outbound marketing and, really building an amazing sales model. At the end of the day, if anybody's here is an entrepreneur, I'd say, the first thing you want to be thinking about after you kind of get the project off the ground and you are seeing that traction is you want to have a person from the leadership side, on the sales side, that will help you really transform that business into something that feeds the rest of the company. And I always kind of go back to, I think some purists kind of have a bit of a philosophy of they kind of get a little almost negative about the monetization aspect of it. But at the end of the day, unless you're monetizing, you can't fund the product development. And we've been able to take it from a core team of, when I joined, was half a dozen developers. Now we have over 100 developers, and that's all because we can fund it, and we just pour, the dollar spent as a percentage on the open source part has probably gone down a little bit, but the absolute spend on open source has gone up by a factor of probably 5 at this point. So.
Thanks. And Mark, you have a very sophisticated model, very quantified, precise model of the customer journey. I don't know how much of that you can share, but I think that would be very interesting, as to how you view the top of the funnel and what the various stages are.
Yeah, and I didn't answer your other question, so I'll be real brief. The company, when I joined, was primarily out there pitching Scala versus Java. Scala is a language that runs on the JVM, and as Salil said, it's pretty damn hard to monetize a language. In fact, I think it's impossible. You can monetize around it through services, of course, but you don't sell a language. But what we did in the first 6 months after I got there was figure out, okay, where is this language and the frameworks, the Play framework and the Akka framework, where are they being used and what kind of use cases are they? And we landed on something that is a category that's been out there, but we kind of have adopted it. It's called reactive, and so we see ourselves as leading this charge towards reactive application development and the platform that runs those reactive apps. Quickly, it means it's an event-driven based system. It's scalable up and down. It's resilient, fault-tolerant, built into the system as opposed to after the fact, and it's responsive, customer interaction, right? So apps like Gilt.com, if you're familiar with a shopping site where they have their flash sales every day at noon, that's very scalable because it needs to deal with that huge volume. It's highly interactive on the phone app. Another app that's using our stuff is Nest, right? The Internet of Things, the thermostat in your home, collecting not just how you're changing your temperature, but also all the information about the environment, right? The weather outside and so forth. And then the other one that everybody here is familiar with is LinkedIn, right? With their engagement platform and services. That's all, I shouldn't say all, but much of it's built on our stuff. So Salil asked me to say, or give you some kind of insight into our model. One of the things I've learned over the last 14 years, especially targeting developers as your primary audience and then trying to monetize through the development phase, but ultimately really monetizing when they roll it out into production, is you need to make sure that you know about the projects, you know who the developers are at the starting point. Well, with open source software, especially open source software where it's out in the community, and you can get all of our stuff without ever talking to TypeSafe, we don't know who those people are. So if you can't find out who they are, you have a tougher time figuring out how to make sure that they're successful. And that's what really matters, is getting those development projects that they're building. The first one is probably the most critical. Make sure they don't fail. Make sure that if they're going to struggle, that you've addressed any issues that they encounter. So we have something at TypeSafe that I borrowed from many companies and just experiences that we call the reactive journey. And it's nothing more than the adoption phases or life cycle of a developer and a company and how they pick up the technology, what they do at each phase, whether it's exploring, just trying things out and building a prototype. And at that phase, clearly we want to make sure that they're getting content, right? That they're getting appropriate help on how to build a particular type of an application. So if it's a use case, we'll target them saying, if you're trying to build a mobile app that has a back-end Hadoop big data platform, here's a sample code, here's a tutorial, here's a video that shows you how to build that kind of an application, and here's a case study or 10. So this journey is nothing more than just at each phase making sure that the individuals get what they need, and for us, on the commercialization side, we find out where they're at. And so we have a product, this is something that Rod Johnson and I talked about doing at VMware, actually SpringSource before VMware. We have a product called Activator. It's a developer experience tool, and it's a web app. And in that web app, you use these tutorials, you experience different parts of the platform. At each phase, we can see what you're doing, and therefore I target, or the product targets content for you, whether it is a tutorial or it's a screencast of a piece of software, or it's a video or something like that. At each of those steps, we can see what you're doing, therefore give you the right content. And ultimately, we monetize during the appropriate time. So if it looks like you need help on a training front, we'll sell you a training class or promote a training class to you. Or if it looks like you're ready to roll out into production because you hit deploy, you're going to get a commercial that pops up and says you have a choice. You have the commercial distribution from TypeSafe, or you can distribute it on the open source stack. And of course, one you pay for and one you don't. So this allows me as a manager of the business to see how we're doing, but it also allows us to be very precise in all of our efforts, whether it's a marketing effort, it's community development efforts, and evangelism, or product efforts, right? Where do I need to put more energy on the product side? So, and I'm pleased to say it's working very well. So.
And Martin, I don't think you need any prodding from me, but why don't you just take us out of the monologue session by telling us what's going to happen to cloud, on-premise cloud stacks? Is it going to be OpenStack, Amazon? What's the proper way to think about it?
That's a great question. So first of all, there's a school of people who thinks that now everything is moving to the public cloud and on-prem environments will just die away. I happen to believe that's not the case. I think all economic systems will always settle on a balance between owning and renting. Old data centers will go away because they're so complicated to manage. But the new ones that you build on private clouds are actually very efficient to manage and operate. And today, if you are a CIO, it's a dilemma. It's actually a trilemma. Because you're sitting there with VMware, and you're completely locked in with VMware. And the only thing you can do is give them more money. And when you give them more money, they bring you software that they call cloud. And you say, I'm running a private cloud. I don't believe it's true, but that's what's happening. On the other side, they are losing, the CIO is losing internal customers to AWS. Because internal customers saying, okay, I've had it. I'm going to the public cloud to do it faster. And that's where we think we play an important role in being the complement of Amazon to run on-prem. So we go to the CIO and say, with Eucalyptus, you get your own Amazon region on your own premises, and you can tune it and configure it the way you like. And then there's the third part of the trilemma, which is the whole OpenStack consortium, where every single legacy vendor, every incumbent vendor who is threatened by AWS and by Google, and to some degree by Microsoft, they banded together and created this OpenStack project, which is enormously powerful because they have every large vendor backing them. IBM, HP, Cisco, Intel, Red Hat, Rackspace, AT&T, you name them. They're all there building an open source private cloud platform. So what do you do? And then, this is not all of it, there's CloudStack, which arguably was the first cloud team to get their product in really good shape. So hats off to the CloudStack team for their engineering skills. But as a CIO, you're sitting there saying, what should I do? I would like to have a unified data center, but I'm completely locked into VMware. I cannot resist what's coming from the OpenStack consortium because it's all my main vendors driving it, and they're doing hardware certification, and they have gear that is designed for it. And then they're looking at the AWS dimension saying, but this will happen, and the future is as defined by AWS with agile development. So how does that play out? We are playing in that game, and we're seeing things happening. It's very early today. We've just learned that of those who look at OpenStack, 40% are looking at Eucalyptus as well. I would love for it to be 100%, but given that we are a small startup and we are battling tens of thousands of people out in the market, I think it's a good share to have 40% attention there. So it's very much open, and I think CIOs will end up doing all three of these. They must have an AWS play, they cannot abandon VMware, and they cannot resist the lure and attraction of OpenStack. Does that make sense?
That's fascinating. Yeah. Let's take a couple questions. Now, that timer was for the entire panel, is that right? Okay, so let's take a couple questions. It would be good if you make your questions applicable to all three CEOs.
As a CEO, when's the last time you wrote code?
Oh, that is so unfair and irrelevant. But the question is, as a CEO, when was the last time you wrote code? By the way, someone asked me this. So someone was pitching me, and I thought I was going to be asking the questions. And he, first thing out of his mouth was, when was the last time you wrote code? And it turned out I was trying to customize some Gmail stuff. And I wasn't smart enough about JavaScript to do it in JavaScript, so I did it in AppleScript on my Mac. And so I showed him that, and although he thought it was goofy, he was sufficiently impressed.
Yeah, I can't follow that. So it was in Fortran, college.
COBOL, college.
I haven't written code in 20 years, and I think that's good for the companies I've been CEO of.
Likewise.
Yeah, so what were you hoping to get from that question?
So I'm a CEO of a startup, and I find myself writing code every now and then, but I'm also trying to do the CEO side of it. And so I'm just kind of curious, at what point do you cut away entirely from code and focus on the business side of the company?
You should ask the CEO of New Relic. He does both, and it's a big, successful company. I'm sort of a stupid hired CEO who doesn't know how to code, so I can't be a role model here.
All right, next question. Good answer.
What on earth convinced you to compete against something as like massive as OpenStack? I guess all three of you can answer that. But it's
Actually,
mostly
the question is actually applicable to all three of their companies, but it's just more evident.
Martin kind of. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
I was tricked into it. I love my job at Eucalyptus, but when I took the job at Eucalyptus, Eucalyptus was the only game in town. By the time I signed the paper and when I joined, we had a dozen competitors. OpenStack with Nimbula, with Nebula, Piston, Cloud Scaling. Then there was Nimbula, Abico, Zimori, and a bunch, and VMware kind of out with their product. So they all happened then. We didn't have at that point our product ready. That's what I said. Our product didn't have the usability to sustain that enormous attack from the world. So it really shook our company, and we've been working hard to come back. Now we love the position we have because we are a single, dedicated, focused team. We deliver stuff. We give away our tested binaries to the whole world. It just works. It's AWS compatible. I do know that 99% of the people here probably believe that OpenStack will win, and they look at me and saying, Martin, why do you keep doing that? But we just see the value of the value prop and the technology we're building, and we're having fun. And we are one group. We don't have to negotiate with others. We don't have to vote for features. We don't have to debate. We don't have to swear at what somebody else did. We're very strict and disciplined in our design and productivity. That's how an engineering team of 35 can have 20 times the code commits on GitHub compared to the OpenStack committers, because our coders write code. So we have an amazing product now. I wish the whole world would recognize it, but give us a little bit more time and you'll see. Thanks for the question.
So we have a minute and a half, and if no one else has questions, I have a question of my own. Nate, all right.
For companies doing private cloud, do you see all three players playing a part in the future, or is it one of them going to take away?
I would compare to relational databases 20 or 30 years ago. You had Oracle, Sybase, Informix, Ingress, IBM DB2, and Microsoft then built theirs on top of Sybase. And I'm still missing one. Yeah, 6. There were 6 database companies that got to $1 billion in revenues. Today, there are 3 remaining. So yes, I do think that there's plenty of business for all the current players, but many have already gone away. So now you have primarily CloudStack, OpenStack, and Eucalyptus on the open source side. Then you have VMware and Microsoft on the closed source side, and that's it. But 4 years ago, we had 3 times that number of players.
So in the half minute we have left, can you put up slide number 2? Because I want to get votes from all 4 of them. Here we go. So we have 2 venture capitalists here with 2 opposing points of view on open source. Peter Levine is saying business model is a failure, everything about it sucks. You can read the bullets here, it's a shit show. And Mike Volpe thinks now is a breakout moment for billion-dollar open source companies. And it's funny that he said billion-dollar open source companies, because we've got one who sold his company for $1 billion, and we've got one who just got valued at 800 million. So if you had to vote, would you say the guy on the right is right, or is?
I'll start with me.
Yeah.
So, well, I certainly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I thought the guy on the left was right. I think there's a lot of points that he makes on the left-hand side that actually are correct. I think if somebody starts to go, especially some of the things like project never gain traction, you compete with open source. If you're off to go start an open source company, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right way to go. I think getting a hold of something that is a project that already has momentum and has gotten through a lot of the kind of the risks up there. And then I think if you're smart about how you build it, if it is all open source all the time, just a support model around it, I don't think that's a very interesting business. But if you build it with You think about all the companies that were built on top of Java. Java was open source, but there's a lot of big companies that were built around it. So it's the model that you build around it, and it's whether you think about it from a strategic, sophisticated way that determines whether you can be successful.
Right. Mark?
Yeah, I would agree. And of course, I'm in the same boat. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe the guy on the right's correct and the guy on the left is wrong. But I think you have to look at it differently. Open source isn't a business model. Open source is a part of your strategy. Open source is a way you get your product either adopted or included in other projects. And if you look at it that way and you build your business based on business principles, then it's different. Instead of just saying, I've got to find a way to monetize all this free people that are using my stuff freely, and look at instead, what are the people who are using it that are getting value out of it, and how can I monetize that value? I shouldn't say forget, but don't try to just say, I've got to take something open source and figure out how to play a game with them and convince them to pay me for it. That doesn't work. And I think that's why Peter Levine is talking about the failures.
And why don't you close us out?
Well, of course, Mike Volpe is right. But if you're wise, you will always listen more attentively to your detractors than your supporters, because there's always something to learn.
All right, our time is up. I want to thank Greg Schott, Mark Brewer, and Marten Mickos. It was so much fun having them here. I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.